Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor at Berkeley, best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I'm also someone who has loved this book for such a long time. I Capture the Castle by Dodie Smith is a novel that I return to again and again, and honestly, of all of the things that I recommend to people and all of the things that I have discussed in my various iterations of these lectures, this is honestly one of the books that is always a crowd pleaser. We begin these lectures with this question of why should we read this book? And I've been wanting to revisit it for a long time, especially as the summer is upon us. And what really gave me the impetus recently is that this was in a list of books by The Atlantic that they suggest you read over the summer. It was, in fact, the very first book on that list, and I was very happy to see my old favorite getting such pride of place in that list. But I also was very happy about the idea that that Atlantic list might mean that more people are revisiting this absolute gem. Super quick housekeeping. I am here in New York, and I thought that I had the working microphone, but I don't. If you are on the podcast or on the YouTube and the audio is not quite what it usually is, that is the reason. And if it sounds good, then we just give full credit here to my MacBook Pro. So mostly what we're going to be doing today is just looking at this book as an absolute joy. We're going to be digging into the prose. We're going to look at some of the elements that make it just such an absolute pleasure to read. We're also going to talk about some of the very sophisticated elements of this book that I think go unnoticed and that I think deserve a lot of credit. In terms of agenda, for those of you who like an agenda, we're going to start with the publication history and a very, very brief bio of Dorothy Gladys Smith, otherwise known as Dodie Smith. The history, the moment in time in which the book was published, is actually very important. And if you have that in mind while you're reading, or think about it afterward, it really can enrich your experience of the book. This is probably a good place to say that I'm not going to spoil anything until the very end when we take a look at the very end of the novel. So this might be an appropriate thing to listen to before you dive in. Often that's great because I do think you'll have a richer experience of the work. But also if you have read it, I think it will also make you love the thing even a bit more. So first we're going to talk about the publication history. We're then going to dive in. We're going to look at the cover art on my hideous copy of this book. I have this very strange copy. It was the only one in my local bookstore. It does such disservice to this work. So we're going to chat about that very briefly. I'm also going to show you the covers of the books that I have, the copies that I have at home, one of which I love. It looks very much like kind of like a Liberty print. It's green. And then the other one that I'm going to show you is, and honestly, if you're on YouTube, I'll just pop a picture of it right now. This is a copy, a first edition of I Capture the Castle that my mom gave to me. She attended the lecture at the bookstore that I gave on it years ago, and it's really one of my prized possessions. She got it through my older brother who deals in rare books. So it was very like an all-in-the-family moment, and I'm just so happy to have what feels to me like a little slice of history. So we're going to talk about the cover art. We're going to talk about the title. Then we're going to dive in and take a quick look at the first paragraph, which is very important in terms of understanding the whole novel. We're going to look at how the narrator functions. We're going to look at some of the levity and some of the joy and the cleverness, just the overall tone of the book. This is not something that we really dig deeply into for the most part here at the Foxed Page, tone. But in this book, it is singular and interesting and definitely deserves a bit of our attention. We're then going to talk about the role of the mother, specifically the absent mother, and how she functions actually a little bit differently in this book than she does, in your typical absent mother / Bambi / fairy tale story. We're then going to talk about some of the meta elements, simply meaning passages that are talking about the writing of the text. And in that same grouping, we're going to talk about intertexts, which are simply other books that are named in this one. We're going to talk a bit about Austen, we're going to talk about the Brontes, and importantly, we're going to talk about James Joyce and how he relates to the father in the story. We're going to take a very quick look at how Americans are seen in the novel and also at the role of pets. Most of you probably know that Dodie Smith is the woman who wrote The 1001 Dalmatians, and she writes about dogs in a way that is so compelling, and I want to take a very quick look at why that is so well done. We're going to take a very quick look at a couple of elements that are sort of problematic, and then we're going to end by looking at the final pages of the book in order to just sink a little bit more deeply into this incredible prose. Okay, quick bio. Dorothy Gladys Dodie Smith was born in 1896 in England. She died in 1990, also in England. She was 94 years old. I'm fairly certain that math is correct. She was a very successful playwright, wrote a bunch of plays. Her most important work, the one she's most known for, is in fact The 1001 Dalmatians. That came out in 1956. But I Capture the Castle, which was published in 1948, is the really, that's the adult book that is really the one that I think is the best. I mean, honestly, I have not gone back and read The 1001 Dalmatians. I am actually sure that it is compelling. We should probably go back. I should probably go back and report to you how that novel is. Obviously, the screen adaptations of that are hugely important. In 1961, just 5 years after Disney did their version of it, there was that live action one. I think that was the one with Emma Stone, which somehow at some point I decoupled Cruella de Vil from The 1001 Dalmatians. And when I was looking through my notes, all of a sudden I was like, oh my gosh, this is the iconic Cruella. So in many ways, Dodie Smith's legacy just for the creation of Cruella de Vil is worthy of lots of attention. So I Capture the Castle, again, it was in 1948. This was written when she was in California. She was married to a man who was a conscientious objector, so they left England before the Second World War, and she wrote the book while she was in California. I love that about it. There's a lot of talk in here about ranches in California, and as a lifelong Californian and someone who spent a lot of time on her cousin's ranch in Calistoga, the idea of a California ranch as being central to a novel that is set in a castle in England really warmed my heart. The book is known, this novel is known as number 82 in the BBC collection, The Big Read, which is a list of very important books that the BBC deems that we should all be reading. In 2019, the BBC News named it one of the 100 most inspiring novels, and I do find it very inspirational. In 2003, there was a film version of it. Rose Byrne plays Rose in it, and I actually have not watched it. I'm sort of saving it as a treat for once I'm done with this lecture. But the trailer itself is just absolutely beguiling. It looks so good. So it's worth taking a moment and noting the fact that this book is published in 1948. So most of you will have in mind that the Second World War, the dates of that are sort of 1939 to 1945. It is crucial to realize that this book was published only 3 years after the end of the Second World War. What's most interesting to me about that date is the fact that it is set in 1934. So what Smith has done in this really interesting way is essentially erased the Second World War. She's writing in, the late 1940s. It comes out in 1948, only 3 years after the end of the war, but it's hearkening back to a much more peaceful time in 1934, well before, well, I'm not sure it was well before, but, significantly before the Second World War. It is such a good trick in many ways because it allows the reader back to kind of a more innocent time. It's allowing for an escape. In fact, The Atlantic named it as a book that's like one that you should read if you want to kind of journey, if you want to escape into another place. And in many ways, you're also escaping into another time. Significantly, also, they are living in a 12th century castle. So you are also escaping even further back. But it's really important to remember that some of the poignancy and some of the real heft of the novel comes from the fact that it was written during those war years. And the California pieces of it are really compelling. The Americans in general, this fixation on Americans, seems very kind of honestly come by in the sense that Dodie Smith was in the United States during the writing of the book. Okay, we're going to dive in and take a look at the actual book itself. So I mentioned how hideous my copy is. I mean, hideous is not the right word. But what we have here, I'm holding it up for those of you on YouTube. It's like these two little blonde, very young girls running through a field toward a beautiful castle. And there's something about the colors and something about the sort of soft focus and the age of these girls that literally make it look like something so cheeseball and something just like not interesting at all. I don't love the font. I don't love anything about this. It also has a blurb up at the top by J.K. Rowling, which reads, "This book has one of the most charismatic narrators I've ever met," which I actually think that's also kind of an understatement. And I also think I actually couldn't figure out when St. Martin's published this. I looked through it pretty carefully. They don't seem to have the publication date, which is very odd, actually. But having the only cover blurb be by J.K. Rowling seems to me a tad insensitive, given that she has made some very controversial and really horrible comments that have made her, I think, somewhat of a wonky person to be looking for your like only blurb on the cover of the book. There have been many other iterations of covers that are all much better. If you're on the YouTube again, I will flash a few of those up now. And if you're on the YouTube, here again is that the first edition that my mom gave to me maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So now we're going to talk briefly about this title. So the title, I Capture the Castle, like any good title, is going to have a bunch of different connotations. So here, largely, we realize right from the beginning that Cassandra Mortmain, who is our narrator and our protagonist, her attempt throughout the entire book is to capture her life in the castle in writing. It is, in fact, speed writing, which is funny, and it's this kind of cryptic writing, which is so interesting in many ways because we think of her text as being very straightforward as opposed to this text that her father is writing, which is very opaque and full of games and full of riddles and clues. But in many ways, what Cassandra is doing with all of her sort of shorthand and all of her own code is creating something that's not that different from the text that her father is writing, which is like this very experimental, very James Joycean kind of work. So she's writing in order to capture their life in the castle in the sense of capturing it and being able to communicate that thing to someone else. There's also this idea of kind of like physically capturing the castle. So in many ways, she loves her home. She loves being there, but they have only leased it from these two brothers who arrive, who are very much the love interests of the novel. So this idea of capturing the castle is a bit tenuous in the sense that she lives there with her family, and yet they are not the people who own it. They have not captured the castle. We also, of course, the idea of a castle really evokes a bygone era. And in many ways, it is a coming of age story. It's a story about someone who is growing from innocence into something that is much more sophisticated. She's moving from this bucolic existence toward the city of London. She's moving from childhood into womanhood with all of the complexities therein. But you really have her in many ways identifying with this very simple life. I mean, she's often bored by it, but this very sort of simple life of what it would have been like to live in a castle. And that is very much in contrast with the life that she will go on to use. There's also like a very slight connotation with chess. There's a lot of chess being played in my family, both virtually and across the board, by all of my children and their friends, which sounds way like nerdier than it actually is. But I've been thinking a lot, not a lot, but I've been thinking some in terms of chess moves these days and capturing the castle. I don't actually really know what that means, but I think the rook is a very important piece, more important than the pawn, at least. Oh my gosh, that's like literally all I know. But, knowing that, there's also castling, which is when you change the one piece for the other. I can't even really remember now. I mean, I'm wading into really unclear waters here. But there is this idea of strategy and this idea of exchanging things and this idea of kind of making a good choice and a good move. This is a good moment after we have looked at the title to talk about the names in the book. So I just mentioned Cassandra Mortmain. She is our protagonist, certainly. And Cassandra is a Greek name. It's one of these Greek figures. And it's a very important one. And in some ways, it should feel heavy-handed when we see it in literature. But when well done, it is not, in fact, heavy-handed. Cassandra was kind of like cursed with this idea that she could tell the future. She was like a prophet, and she could make these prophecies and they were true. But the thing that she's kind of cursed by is the fact that no one would believe her. There is another novel. It is called Cassandra at the Wedding. This is a book that is actually set in California, and it is set on a ranch in California. It is unbelievable. That is another crowd pleaser. Every single person I recommend that book to just cannot get enough of it. And I love this strong Cassandra woman at the heart of both of them. And in fact, both of them are coming of age stories. There are a lot of similarities between the two. So we have Cassandra. And Cassandra, to me, stands in pretty stark contrast to her sister Rose. So Cassandra has these kind of Greek connotations. It's sort of sophisticated. It has to do with language and communication. Rose, to me, is more kind of like an English rose, like a little more delicate, a little more decorative. You also, of course, have this idea of someone who has risen, someone who rose up. And in many ways, she does rise up into society in a way that her sister does not. But it seems like kind of a more trite name, like a much less interesting name in many ways. And I think it's very bold for Smith to have had these sisters with such kind of pointed names in some ways. Their younger brother is Thomas. He's very clever. And he is someone who unlocks the keys at a couple of important points. One of the things he understands is what his father is trying to do, their father is trying to do with literature. And you can kind of associate Thomas in that case with doubting Thomas. He's like maybe one of the apostles. Oh my gosh, that's so embarrassing that I don't have that like right in my mind. But this idea of doubting Thomas, he is very clever, and he does sort of look at things in a somewhat skeptical way, but also he's very bright. Things come very easily to him. The other young person who's kind of floating around is Stephen. So in Greek, Stephen has to do with honor. It has to do with victory and fame. So this Stephen in the novel is like a young servant who essentially lives in this tiny little room and takes care of everybody, sort of like a jack of all trades who lives in the castle and supports the family. But he is someone where, without spoiling anything, I would say that victory and fame are kind of within his reach in an interesting way. Saint Stephen is also the first Christian martyr. I did not know that, but I did find it out when I looked it up. If you want to be a better reader, take a look at the names. If it is a book that is well written, the names should really have a lot of, potential for unpacking. So this idea of him being the first Christian martyr was so funny to me because in many ways, Stephen is very martyrous. And I loved our relationship between Cassandra and Stephen. Again and again, like you had this sense that things could get very romantic. And almost every time I was so pleased with the choices that Cassandra makes. And then the other two people in this household are Topaz, who is their stepmother, and Mortmain, who is their father. And I want to take just a quick minute to read a couple of the different things just to get some of the tone right here at the top. So when we have this first description of Topaz, so, in any fairy tale, the stepmothers tend to be, evil stepmothers. In this case, she is absolutely not that. And I really like the way that again and again, Dodie Smith is really pushing against a lot of our expectations and our stereotypes. So here we have Topaz. And she is such a vivid character. Every character in this book, even the minor ones, are so well drawn in a way that feels light and just sort of easy and effortless. But when you take a step back and realize all that you know about these people, it's just incredibly well done. So in terms of Topaz, we have this kind of levity of tone, but also a really beautifully kind of rich experience of who she is. 3 years ago, or is it 4, I know Father's one spasm of sociability was in 1931, a stepmother was presented to us. We were surprised. She's a famous artist's model who claims to have been christened Topaz. Even if this is true, there is no law to make a woman stick to a name like that. Which I thought was so funny. So Topaz, honestly, it sounds like more of a name for a cat. But there is so much here. It is a name that Cassandra is very skeptical about, cannot take seriously. It's also telling us so much about this woman who claims to have been christened Topaz. Like the suspicion on the part of our narrator there is excellent. And then this idea that even if that were her given name, that it's really too absurd and she shouldn't go by it. She's very very ethereal. I always picture her as those pre-Raphaelite people, those very pale, very saturated, very detailed illustrations of those women with all the long red hair. It's always Ophelia floating in the water, that kind of thing, or the lady of the lake or whatever that is. So she's a famous model who has a bunch of portraits in the Tate, which is one of those ways that Dodie Smith is anchoring us very much in England, which is such an efficient way of showing us the sort of prestige and the kind of grandeur and kind of gentrification of this family. Meanwhile, they are living, basically in poverty inside this castle. So the father is named Mortmain, which is spelled Mortmain. In French, that would mean dead hand. And of course, what is significant about that is that the father wrote this one important book and then has never been able to write anything since. So in some ways, his hand is dead. But again, we have this kind of elevation of them. It's very fancy to think about them with this kind of French overtone. And our narrator makes a lot of the fact that it is Topaz who insists on calling him Mortmain, both because she's trying to sort of hearken back to his glory days, but also because she's trying to elevate him. We're going to look toward the end. There is one point where our narrator says her name together. She calls herself Cassandra Mortmain. And you have this idea then of her really coming into herself. And it is really significant that she's calling herself at the end of the novel, when she has a much better sense of who she is, she's calling herself by a name, Dead Hand, but she's calling herself by a name that is very much wrapped up in this idea of being a writer. Super briefly, I'll just mention that Neil, who is one of the brothers, Neil in Irish means passionate or champion, which says a huge amount about what happens with him in the book. Okay, we're going to go on now and take a look at the first paragraph of this novel. If you're a longtime listener to the Fox page, you know that one of the ways that you can become like a better reader, if that is why you are here, is to really just pay attention. It sounds basic, but I think a lot of us, move through books. And if that's the way you're reading, that's great. Just like chill and just enjoy yourself. Just let it wash over you. But if you're wanting to really engage more, if you're wanting to engage more, you should write. You should read with a pencil. You should always be underlining things. You should be circling. You're never going to go back and look at them. I don't. But it really does help you engage more with a book. But the other thing that you should be doing, if it is a book worth its salt, when you read the first paragraph, certainly the first paragraph, but also maybe the first chapter, it will really point you in important directions in terms of what this book is trying to do. So on page 3 of my copy, I write this sitting in the kitchen sink. That is, my feet are in it. The rest of me is on the draining board, which I have padded with our dog's blanket and the tea cozy. I can't say that I'm really comfortable, and there's a depressing smell of carbolic soap, but this is the only part of the kitchen where there is any daylight left. And I have found that sitting in a place where you have never sat before can be inspiring. I wrote my very best poem while sitting on the hen house, though even that isn't a very good poem. I've decided my poetry is so bad that I mustn't write any more of it. So many important things are happening here. In the very beginning, the very first word of the entire novel is I. The second word is I write this. That's 3 words. And that might, you probably just glossed right over that, but it is hugely important. This is a young woman whose voice we are hearing. It's also the voice of a narration who is, of a narrator who is dreamed up by a woman. So we have this very strong female voice right from the start. And it is not a tentative voice. It is also telling us right from the start that what is important here is that that voice is writing. She's saying, I write. We also have this immediacy here because it is in the present tense. I write this is happening right now. She's writing it down in real time. And there is so much beautiful immediacy. There was a whole vein of that I wanted to look at, but I realized we were really getting into the weeds. But again and again, partly because of this first person narration and because a lot of the book is in present tense, we really do have the sense that these things are happening right now. There's a real immediacy and proximity to all of this that is really important. We also have this idea of the kitchen sink here. So, everything but the kitchen sink, has this idea of plenitude and this idea of lots of detail and putting a lot of things in. And this is a book, this time it actually did not feel long, like it didn't feel overly long, but I really remembered how rich it is. A lot happens in this book. Many different people have arcs. There are lots of different locations. There's so much beautiful description. So you really do have a sense that this is a book that's going to have a lot. We're going to have everything. It is also a book that is going to focus on the domestic. So it starts in the kitchen. A lot of stuff happens in the kitchen. The kitchen is also kind of the one main room, and in fact, like the only warm room in the castle, which is so important because what she is capturing here is not, obviously it's not battles and it's not the life of a knight. It is really very much about a domestic group who is living in this castle. And then lastly, we have this idea of perspective, that she's sitting here and it's the only place where there's light. So that's speaking to illumination and how she's going to illuminate things for us. But we also have this sense, she says it to us, like she has found that if she sits in unusual spaces and looks at things from a different perspective, then she has a better understanding of them. So what she's promising to us is that she will give us unique perspectives, and she certainly does. Lastly, which I think is so funny, she's throwing the idea of poetry right out the window. But there's a lot of comment here, both in terms of Cassandra and in terms of Stephen, of not being able to write good poetry. And I think I, for one, it's embarrassing, again, to admit that I'm not, in fact, a poetry lover. But I did enjoy the fact here that she's like, my poetry is so bad, I am not going to write any more of it. There's also a certain level there, in a more serious way, that she's telling us what I write is going to be good. Like, I am somewhat of an arbiter of taste, and I can tell you that my poetry was not good, and I pushed it aside. So essentially what I'm going to give you is good. Those of you on the YouTube might notice that I just did a quick costume change. I was trying to do something kind of English and juvenile, so I had on like a little pink Argyle sweater vest that actually belonged to my daughter. It was so itchy. I was just like distracted. So now I have on a different sweater vest. But I want to go ahead and read we're going to read the next 2 paragraphs of the beginning, because what Dodie Smith is doing here, it seems so light and just sort of fun and so rich and beautiful. But what she's doing here is very important. Importantly, the book is actually kind of dated. It begins in March, it ends in October. So we're beginning, March is very early. It's not sort of like, well into spring. So we're beginning at the end of winter. We're beginning with cold. We're beginning with darkness. And what we're going to have, if you think about those for even a half second, you have this idea of like lots of growth is coming and change and blossoming and all of the kind of plenitude of summer. So at the beginning, she's really leaning into that. If you, like me, happen to sort of skip over chapter titles, in fact, this one is called The Sixpenny Book, March. If you happen to skip over that, it also has illustrations, which I couldn't find anywhere in the book saying that Dodie Smith did them, but I also couldn't find out that anyone else did them. So I have to presume that she did them. They're actually very sweet. They're line drawings, and you might skip over them a little bit, but they're worth taking a look at. So here we have her setting the scene in a way that it's very efficient. We're having a lot of information conveyed to us, but it is in this tone that is so beautifully consistent throughout the book. It's slightly light, but also very passionate in an interesting way. Drips from the roof are plopping into the water butt by the back door. The view through the windows above the sink is excessively drear. Beyond the dank garden in the courtyard are the ruined walls on the edge of the moat. Beyond the moat, the boggy, plowed fields stretch to the leaden sky. I tell myself that all the rain we have had lately is good for nature, and that at any moment spring will surge on us. I try to see leaves on the trees and the courtyard filled with sunlight. Unfortunately, the more my mind sees green and gold, the more drained of all color does the twilight seem. In some ways, too, knowing the end of the book, it is very, I am going to tell you, this book is not a tragedy, but it is not quite as kind of buoyant and romantic and kind of cliche as you might think. It is in fact a very sophisticated ending, and I'm realizing now it's always so interesting to go back to the beginning right after you've finished. I'm realizing that in the beginning we do have some overtones of the complexity of where we are going to end. So right under that she's talking about how drained of color does the twilight seem. It is comforting to look away from the windows and towards the kitchen fire, near where my sister Rose is ironing, though she obviously can't see properly, and it will be a pity if she scorches her only nightgown. I have two, but one is minus its behind. Rose looks particularly fetching by firelight because she is a pinkish person. Her skin has a pink glow, and her hair is pinkish gold, very light and feathery. Although I am rather used to her, I know she is a beauty. She is nearly 21 and very bitter with life. I am 17, look younger, feel older. I am no beauty, but have a neatish face. So a couple of things here that make it feel sort of juvenile. When she says she is a pinkish person, that is kind of this unusual and in some ways kind of little kid kind of way to describe someone. But it also is doing that thing she promised she would do, which is giving us kind of an interesting perspective on things. She also has like the kind of adolescent feel of this, and the passion of it comes from kind of a conviction. When she says she is nearly 21 and very bitter with life, that's this kind of very strong statement. It's a little exaggerated. She's very bitter with life and sort of, large in scope. And I love the fact that we have these little detailed things. Her hair is very, feathery and light. And then she is very bitter with life. We have these beautiful counterpoints of like these large passionate statements that have some exaggeration in them, together with a very kind of light touch where the description is concerned. We also have this idea here, she looks younger but feels older. And that in some ways is important because Cassandra, as our trusty narrator, we want her to be more interesting than Rose. And in many ways what she wants and what she chooses is more interesting than Rose, although that is arguable. But it is very good at the beginning to have this sense that we are being narrated to by the slightly more interesting sister. So one of the ways that the levity that we see at the very beginning of the book, one of the ways that is important and that it sort of manifests itself throughout the book is with the presence, in fact, the absence of the mother. So there is an old saw with literature that sort of no adventure can ensue if there is a mother around, which is just very interesting. I mean, the idea being, of course, that a mother would keep things under control and would sort of regulate decisions and would sort of protect her children, and that life is much more interesting once you have taken a mother out of the picture. It's kind of shocking how many works of literature are families where the mother is absent. In fact, Cassandra at the Wedding is another one where there is no mother figure. And what happens here is the mother becomes very shadowy. In fact, that is literally the word that Cassandra is using to describe the absence of her mother. But there is also a levity. There's sort of this idea that the mother's absent, and in many ways that's hard. But it also seems like this kind of like slightly ambivalent, very kind of realistic way. I mean, also perhaps totally not realistic, but it's kind of this unusual attitude on the part of Cassandra about her missing mother. But I found it really interesting, the kind of matter-of-fact nature with which she is discussing the mother, and also the matter-of-fact and like really very appreciative way that they welcome Topaz as this very unconventional, but really in many ways delightful stepmother figure. So on pages 5 and 6, so very much toward the beginning of the book, right after the description of the castle and the description of Rose, we have this mention about the mother. And before I read this, importantly, one of the plot points is that the father lost his temper at one point and went after the mother with a cake knife, and in fact had to spend 3 months in prison. And even that is described with a lot of levity. In fact, probably with more levity than should be described. There is a part at the end where he loses his temper with Cassandra and in fact pushes her, and there is, like a fairly traumatic and violent situation there that is also handled with a certain amount of levity in a way that made me a little uncomfortable. It maybe is fitting into one of these problematic aspects of the novel. There are different times when class and race and, in fact, domestic violence are treated in a very light way that can be seen as sort of problematic, although they're just like tiny glimpses. I think I'm so tuned to look for these kinds of things that they stand out. But there's a lot less of this in 1948 than there could have been. So on page 5, mother died 8 years ago from perfectly natural causes. There, little joke about the fact that she did not die from the cake knife. I think she must have been a shadowy person because I have only the vaguest memory of her, and I have an excellent memory for most things. I can remember the cake knife incident perfectly. I hit the fallen neighbor with my little wooden spade. Father always said this got him an extra month. Again, I mean, that's in parentheses, her role in this whole thing. But, it's a very serious thing, and yet it is being treated with levity here. This idea, I mean, in some ways it's cute, and in some ways it's very sad that she would have any role. And the idea of her going over and, bopping the neighbor in this very juvenile way speaks to the levity, not only of the tone of the book in general, but also with which the family is dealing with things. It's also interesting that is sort of the end of this description of the mother. Right from there we go, so 8 years ago the mother died, and then 3 years ago a stepmother was presented to us. So this mention of the mother is very quick. We also, though, at the very end of the book, in some ways this book has lots of sort of bookends. We have a lot of things where we have come full circle, which again is another reason that it's interesting to go back and look at the beginning. So that was pages 5 and 6. On page 307, we have like another time, it's sort of one of the only maybe 3 or 4 or 5 times when the mother is prominent in the book. On page 307, we have this really beautiful description of her sort of arriving in the text. Importantly, we find out that she was a very important inspiration for Mortmain. In fact, we wonder if, in fact, her death had to do with him not, in fact, being able to write anymore. And here she arrives in the text at the very end when Cassandra and Thomas, her younger brother, cook up this plan to try to cure their father's writer's block. So on 307, we have this. Godson church clock had begun to strike 10, and suddenly, as well as the far-off booming bell, I heard in memory the tinkling chime of Mother's little traveling clock. And then my mind's eye saw her face. Not the photograph of it, which is what I always see when I think of her, but her face as it was. I saw her light brown hair and freckled skin. I had forgotten until then that she had freckles. And that same instant, I heard her voice in my head after all these years of not being able to hear it. A quiet, clipped little voice it was, completely matter of fact. It said, "Do you know, dear, I believe that scheme of yours might work quite well." I heard my own voice answer, "But Mother, surely we couldn't? It's fantastic." "Well, your father's quite a fantastic man," said Mother's voice. Then, just genius. We have this next paragraph. She says, "That second, a gust of wind slammed the tower door just above me." So we have this idea of hearing the mother's voice, but then having a door slam on it. So a couple of things here. The mother's voice is matter of fact, and she is supporting, this plan that Cassandra has, but it's this kind of matter of fact voice. We also hear that it was a clipped little voice, and we do find out fairly soon after this that she was a real muse and a real helpmeet to the father. It's important that her voice is one that we are hearing toward the end when Cassandra is making decisions about her future liberation. But I also really appreciate the fact that this is not some really like overdrawn, like deeply dramatic moment. It is in fact more kind of matter of fact. Importantly, we have a couple of stand-ins, a couple of foils for the mom. There's a school teacher named Miss Marcy. There is a dressmaker's dummy called Miss Blossom, who often, quote unquote, speaks to the girls. And what I mean by that is Cassandra gives voice to all sorts of different things that Miss Blossom might be saying. And Topaz, in many ways, is a very important maternal figure, although she's closer in age to the girls, so she's kind of more like a sister to begin with. And she's always doing things like, communing with nature and getting naked. And she is not, in fact, able to really inspire writing in her husband. So the absence of the mother definitely can be felt, but I appreciate the way that it is not kind of overblown. It's not a huge, huge plot point. And when it appears, it's sort of this interesting kind of matter-of-fact presence. So we're going to move on now and talk about this idea of intertexts. These are texts that appear in the book. It's always important to stop and think about what the author is trying to do. So when we have mention in the very beginning of Pride and Prejudice and Jane Austen, I mean, that begins with that very famous quotation about how, every young woman is in need of a husband or whatever that thing is. And from the very beginning, we have the arrival of Bingley and Mr. Darcy, and the young family of girls is just kind of all a twitter because they might find, in fact, a rich husband. It is literally like the exact same premise, and in many ways, it's really skillful of Dodie Smith to just go ahead and name what it is she is doing. The other thing is that a lot of these books are dealing with what is called the marriage plot. And this goes all the way back to kind of to the idea of tragedy versus comedy. So in the Greek era, really the definition of a comedy was that it ended in marriage. And that holds in literature for a long, long time, through Shakespeare, all of these different things. If things kind of work out well for people, and for women in particular, then the piece of writing or the play will end with a marriage. That is obviously a plot and an arc, and sort of this marriage plot concept is something that people are really pushing against in really important ways. And in many ways, this book is also doing that. But I love the fact that right at the start, Smith is really pointing out that she is playing with that. There are a lot of other intertexts here. At one point, we mentioned the Brontes, and that's kind of a double thing, because not only do we have like Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre, and this idea of, young girls out on like windswept English landscapes, but we also have the idea of the Bronte sisters and Jane Austen. I mean, it's no coincidence that she is choosing female writers, because these are female writers whose work has stood the test of time, and they really do serve as kind of like a blueprint for how Cassandra might move forward. We know from the beginning she wants to be a writer, so these people are obviously looming large. But the book I want to talk about just a little more in detail is this idea of Jacob wrestling. I have to say, the first time I read it, I wasn't paying very much attention at all to what it was that the father was writing. But this time I did take a slightly closer look. So Jacob wrestling, so this idea of Jacob wrestling with the angel, I did have that in mind. These are one of those biblical phrases. I am not a biblical scholar. It's kind of like my reading of the Greek tragedies or comedies, all of those works, all of those plays in particular. That is not a really strong body of knowledge that I have at my hands. We had a course in high school called The Bible as in Literature, and I really wish I paid more attention, because that would have been very cool. I just remember about nothing from that class. Although maybe Jacob wrestling with the angel came from that. I do not know. Jacob wrestling with the angel comes from Genesis. It comes from the Bible. It's very early Bible. And it is this idea that Jacob spent all night long, he was away from his family, spent all night long wrestling with this kind of angel, and it might have been God, or it might have been an angel, and the Bible's a little bit unspecific about that. And what he is seeking, what Jacob is seeking, is a blessing. There is some thinking that he's kind of like a pre-Christ kind of figure. In the end, he ends up with a new name, which is Israel. At one point, there's a ladder, and this ladder it essentially looks like a staircase leading up to heaven. And one of the things that we know about the book, Jacob Wrestling, that Mortmain has written, is there is a ladder in it, and in fact the ladder is shaped by words, which speaks to this idea of experimental literature. Some of you know like Apollinaire, who is a French poet, who like when the writing is on the page, it like looks like things which always seemed kind of juvenile to me, but also kind of cool. So one of the things that is very cool and could be heavy-handed, but isn't, it just ends up kind of boosting our appreciation of what Mortmain has done, is that when Simon arrives, Simon being the British of the two brothers, when Simon arrives, it turns out he's a big fan of Jacob wrestling. And again, that could be like too coincidental, but what it does is make you think like, oh, this is a book that was actually pretty famous. Simon is also a literary critic, so you have an idea here that, he might be aware of difficult texts that everyone else is not aware of. So this is a book that was thought to be, revolutionary and really important in terms of the body of English literature. And many of the allusions that are made, especially toward the end, are speaking, I think, to James Joyce and the idea of a lot of that kind of surrealistic experimental literature that was happening in the 1920s and 30s, essentially all of the modernist writing. So Ulysses by James Joyce was published in 1922 in Paris. It actually came out in kind of serial editions a couple of years before that. And there is a ladder in Ulysses also. We have this idea, it's in the beginning, Telemachus, it's in the first part of Ulysses, and it's essentially a ladder that kind of leads into the novel, into the action. I mean, insofar as Ulysses is a novel. I will say right now, I did at one point really dive into Ulysses. I had to be, oh my gosh, when my daughter was little, she was an ice skater, which I loved watching her ice skate, but she would ice skate for like 90 seconds, And at one point, I had to spend 10 days at an ice skating competition. That was not a world that I loved. I was not like right in there with all the skating moms. I mean, I liked them, but I wasn't like really like into all of the competitive ice skating the way that they were. I always was so freaked out because whenever you were in the stands with all those people, I had this really strong feeling that like one kid is out there, like my kid is out there doing her thing, and her coach and I are hoping she's going to do well. Literally every other person in the entire place wants her to fail. There was so much crazy energy at these things. I mean, and I will say, when the other kids were out there and they were competition against my daughter, I was not like really radiating a lot of positive energy toward them. But I digress. I brought Ulysses. That is a book that you cannot read on its own. You need to read it with all sorts of references all around. This was like, very early aughts. So this was not when I had like a computer that had reliable internet. So I brought all of these kind of books because I had learned that when we go on these long 10-day ice skating junkets, that I really needed to have a counterpoint, and Ulysses was absolutely that. I did find it interesting and I found it very worthwhile. Now that I am just like so deeply obsessed with Irish literature, I should go back to it. And I will say that it's not something to be attempted lightly. And the fact that it is known as kind of like the archetypal, Finnegan's Wake is the one that's truly unreadable, but the fact that this is this kind of very experimental literature is important because the evocations and the parallels between what Mortmain is doing and what Ulysses is doing are really potent. So we're going to look briefly at some of that description on page 334. And it's important, we're going to get to why it's important beyond just the fact that this is what the father is writing. So on 334, this is when Thomas, the younger brother, is explaining to his older sister, Cassandra, what it is that their father is up to. Importantly, at the top of this page, we have these two quick paragraphs. Apparently, I was all wrong about father. Apparently, it is very clever to start a book by writing, "The cat sat on the mat 19 times. Then we have a paragraph break. Now stop it, Cassandra Mortmain. You are still piqued because Thomas was the one to guess that what we found in the tower wasn't just nonsense. So we have this idea here of her naming herself, now stop it, Cassandra Mortmain. She is really coming into the idea of this last name and her full name. She's coming, we're at the end of the novel, she's coming into her adulthood, and her own last name, importantly, not a married last name, and one that is very associated with the idea of writing. So there's this book, apparently, he wrote The Cat Sat on the Mat 19 times. That's how the new book opens. And her younger brother, Thomas, has this. And there is a perfectly logical explanation. So they say that in the new edition of the book, he only has 7 times the cat sat on the mat. And there is a perfectly logical explanation of them, according to that bright boy Thomas. They are supposed to be in the mind of a child learning to read and write. Am I unusually stupid? Am I old-fashioned? Oh, I can see that father's puzzles and problems are clever in themselves, that the language in which he sets them out conjures up beautiful images, but why are they supposed to be more than puzzles and problems? And then right across, If only Father would answer a few questions, if Thomas would throw out some more of his bright ideas. After telling me Section A was a child learning to read and write, he decided he was not prepared to say any more. So we have this idea that Thomas is pointing her in the right direction, but very much like the point of these kinds of books, this experimental kind of literature that really makes the reader work hard, Thomas is also making his sister work hard. Then we have this hilarious thing, she says Thomas isn't prepared to say anymore. Topaz, of course, is always delighted to air her views, but I hardly find them helpful. Her latest contributions are cosmic significance and spherical profundity, which is so funny. Again, she's a little airy-dairy. She's always being sort of histrionic. She speaks in a lower voice because she wants to sound sort of dramatic. She's such a great character. But then on page 337, we have a bit more about this text. And now it is Simon who is speaking. It's another male figure who is explaining this to her, which is all very, patriarchal. But there you have it. So importantly, toward the end here, when Simon is talking with her, at one point he talks about how this idea of enigma is important and that Cassandra's father had a very important forerunner. And in my mind, I was like, oh, we're obviously talking about James Joyce. But in fact, Simon was talking about God and the mystery and the enigma of the universe and how it was created and how we are supposed to interpret it. And Sandra says this. Cassandra. Oh my God, Sandra. Wow, Sandra is not the same name as Cassandra. So at the bottom of 336, he says, God made the universe an enigma. And she says, and very confusing it's been for everybody. I don't see why Father had to copy him. Simon said he thought every creative artist did, and that perhaps every human being was potentially creative. I think one of the things your father is after is to stimulate that potential creativeness, to make those who study his work share in its actual creation. So that is literally the definition of experimental literature. If you think of any of the modernist writers, so certainly the poets, T.S. Eliot, poetry in general makes the reader work a little harder. But other writers like Virginia Woolf or like Faulkner in the United States, it can be very satisfying, sometimes it can be very opaque and difficult, to be a reader who is also helping in the creation, who is assisting and who is sort of co-creating with a writer. And then Simon says a little further down, I think your father believes that the interest so many people take in puzzles and problems, which often starts in earliest childhood, represents more than a mere desire for recreation, that it may even derive from man's eternal curiosity about his origin. So again, here's Simon going way back before Joyce, all the way, to the origin of mankind. Anyway, it makes use of certain faculties for progressive cumulative search, which no other mental exercise does. Your father wants to communicate his ideas through those faculties. I asked him to repeat it slowly, and suddenly I saw. Oh, I saw absolutely. So then she goes on to ask some questions about sort of how it works. And interestingly, there's a lot of talk then about crossword puzzles. And what I loved about that was kind of the ludic nature of ludic, just meaning playful and sort of childlike. And this has been a somewhat long digression about what the father is up to, but I do think it's really important to look at. What's happening with all of this stuff with Jacob wrestling is we're meant to read it, I think, as a counterpoint to the novel that is in our hands. So in many ways, when she's doing all of this thinking about writing, and really the book is, her sort of dry run and her sort of teaching herself how to write, which, oh my gosh, I wish this is like what my learning to write ended up being. But she's speaking here about this idea of the reader having to take part, but also that can be a very playful exercise. It can be very much, like completing a crossword puzzle. It can be very simple in some ways. You have to think about it a little bit. And frankly, this is not a novel that you have to really think a lot about, but it is a novel that if you dig a little deeper, there are all sorts of really important rewards. And she is making some very big statements about choices and about the idea of being independent or the idea of spending your life really attached to someone else. There are all sorts of really large philosophical questions that have a lot to do with art. There's the whole part of the book that has to do with Leda Fox Cotton, who is this kind of innovative photographer. There's a lot of art making that's happening. In some ways, Cassandra's Midsummer Night Rites are a form of art. We have lots of paintings being done by McMorris of Topaz. So we have all of these different forms of art that are happening. We have photography, painting, dance in some ways. We have tons of music. I wish I really knew a lot about music, because we could talk for, hours about the music in this book. We do not have the time for that. But there is all of these different questions about art and its role. And I really appreciate the way that at the heart of it, we have this challenging text that we don't have to actually read, but that is speaking to all of the different ways that the actual novel itself is achieving what we as readers want. So we're only going to touch very briefly on a couple of the things about the Americans in the novel. I mean, I was obviously reading this with an ear toward that because I am American, and I'm always so fascinated to see how we are portrayed. I'm worried, frankly, that often it's not great. But in this case, what happens often is that the presence of Neil, who is the American in the book, it really allows Cassandra to see, he'll either say something or he'll make an observation or he'll show her, something that he is seeing. And it allows her to see England in a completely different way. So one of the best things about having someone who is not from England is that it allows for a different perspective. So she's doing that thing she promised at the beginning, where she's giving us this completely different point of view, which is really enlightening. In fact, she articulates this very explicitly at one point. She's talking about Neil. One thing he said was that he could never get used to the miracle of the long English twilight. It had never struck me before that we have long twilights. Americans do seem to say things which make the English notice England. So it's really beautiful. It's one of the things they say is that at one point that everything that's so beautiful in England is very melancholy, which is one of these other sort of counterpoints, one of these elements of this work that make it not just seem like kind of a trifle. And it's really beautiful the way that she underscores that. At one point she says that Americans seem more affectionate. At a different point, she's talking about essentially the wealth of Americans and all their consumerism and how all of them must have gramophones and kind of their technological advancement. There's also a hilarious part where Neil is doing a barbecue for them, and there she talks about Brer Rabbit, which is a very problematic American text. But she talked about how he did a barbecue and how she had always wondered and didn't know what that was. And then he did it, and she said that the steak was burnt on the outside and raw on the inside, but that it was delicious, which I thought was just a very excellent description of how an American might cook meat, which would be very different from the way that an English person in 1948 would be cooking her meat. So we're going to take a quick look here at some descriptions of the dog. And then we're going to close by looking at some of the beautiful prose and specifically the very close of the novel. So I did not mention this before, and I should have. Heloise and Abelard are the names of the dog and the cat. It's a bull terrier, which I have to say is not my favorite kind of dog. I have very strong feelings about dog breeds, and I really like actually a lot of them. That is one of my least favorites. It's probably because of that really weird and very bestiality heavy kind of advertisement where I think the dog was called Bud or something, but it was for Budweiser, and the dog was a bull terrier, and women in gross skimpy bathing suits. I mean, the bathing suits were not that gross, but their use of skimpy bathing suits was gross in the advertising campaign. But they're all kind of falling all over this dog. It's so bizarre. If you're on YouTube, I will pop an image of it up there for you. It's honestly so odd that now I think I'm maybe misremembering it, but I'm fairly certain. I mean, I don't think I would dream something like that up. It's so odd. But so we have this bull terrier, and that is the girl. I for some reason, I also, because I knew it was a bull terrier, I kept conceiving her, Heloise, as a male. Those dogs all seem kind of male to me, which is weird. Then Abelard is the cat. So Heloise and Abelard are a very important French play. I think it's really old, from the 1200s or something, maybe the 1400s, but really, really old text. And it's epistolary, so it's letters back and forth. And I think it's Persian in origin, but it's these two lovers. It was a nun and her teacher, and they fall in love with each other and they have some sort of affair. I mean, it's very not great in some ways. But it is this kind of archetypal, unrequited love affair story. And it is significant that these young people, that these young women have these animals who are, named after this archetypal romantic pair. So I want to read on page 206. And every time we are looking at specific pieces of the prose, we're also, of course, just enjoying how absolutely beautiful this prose is. So on 206, we have this. We slept for hours. I don't think I ever slept so long in the daytime. I felt terribly guilty when I woke up and found it was nearly 4 o'clock. Hell thumped her tail as if I had just come back from somewhere, and Ab gave us a look as if he had never seen either of us before in his life. Which just killed me. I mean, that is so like dog versus cat. You know, the dog is so happy to see you waking up, and the cat literally is looking at you like, oh my God, who are these people who are suddenly in my space? It's just such an efficient and economic and really fun way to capture the essence of like dog versus cat here. So Heloise, whose name they call her Hell, and Hell ends up being this. It ends up sounding a couple of times like expletives, so it adds to this kind of jokey, kind of slapstick, kind of punny humor. But it always works for me. So I also want to take another look at when we see the dog Heloise in particular. This is when Cassandra is out sort of in the woods by herself, and then a gentleman arrives. Cassandra, a long drawn-out call. This time I knew it was a man's voice, but I still couldn't recognize it. I was sure it wasn't Father's or Stephen's or Thomas's. It was a voice that had never called me before. Here I am, I called back. Who is it? Someone was moving through the mist, crossing the bridge. Heloise came racing ahead, very pleased with herself. So we have so much important stuff here. I mean, she's in the woods, she's hearing this calling, and then someone's coming across a bridge, which is very important symbolically in terms of bridging worlds. It's also a liminal space, so anytime you have a space that has to do with travel or transition, it often means that a character might be transitioning or not in certain ways. So we have this kind of heady, like somewhat, it's not tense, but it's like this kind of important moment. And then this idea of Heloise racing ahead, being very pleased with herself. We have this leavening of the thing that is so good. So the last description of Heloise I want to look at really is underscoring this idea, especially we're a little later in the book. This is page 257. We're really underscoring this concept of her as like a romantic and in fact a sexualized creature, not in the way that the Budweiser ad did. So on 257 we have this. Oh, it is so hot in this room. I daren't open the window wide in case Heloise takes a flying leap out of it. One of her suitors, the sheepdog from Four Stones, is prowling round the castle. Heloise, darling, he would be a most unsuitable match. I wonder if he has gone. No, he hasn't. There are 2 dogs now, just the other side of the moat. I feel terribly sorry for love-lorn dogs. I can't say Heloise is minding it much, though. She is looking rather smug. So this is so interesting. I mean, picking apart these paragraphs is really helping me understand why this book is so rich, because there is so much happening here. So I love the fact that Cassandra is talking about this unsuitable match. So one of the things that happens in the book is this very classist thing where her father is concerned that maybe Cassandra is sort of making a match with someone who is a lower class than them. I don't want to spoil anything, which is highly problematic, obviously, in very classist ways. But we do have this question of suitable matches. It's obviously looming fairly large throughout the book. So what we have in the end here is she's kind of projecting that onto Heloise. And then importantly, we have outside, the window, so far away across the moat here, we have not just the one dog, but then the 2 dogs. So of course we should think of Simon and Neil as these 2 suitors. And then this kind of compassion that she has for love-lorn dogs really speaks to the fact that the decision that she makes is maybe going to end up leaving several, I'm trying not to spoil here, at least more than one love-lorn man. That's actually a good segue into that when I mentioned before that we're going to talk about the elements that are slightly problematic. It's actually kind of a small amount of things. So we have this class issue, but in many ways there's a lot of mobility for Stephen, and we have a lot of kind of crossing of age and of class lines ultimately. Maybe not with Cassandra and Stephen, but with other people. So maybe in some ways we can talk about this book not as being classist, but also as speaking, largely because of the war, both the First World War and the Second, that everything there's enough turmoil in English society that things are getting kind of looser in terms of a lot of that rigid social stuff. I mentioned something about race. So Lita Fox Cotton has a giant photograph, like this huge, big, giant photograph of a Black man, and he's naked. And when they refer to this image, they say her Negro. So you have this sense it's not great. And in fact, it's very fetishizing in lots of ways. But I don't want to give the impression, that there's sort of overt racism throughout the book. There's also that moment where Mortmain, the father of Cassandra, is sort of violent with her. And that is not really remarked upon. Like, it seems kind of fine for Cassandra. Not to mention the fact that earlier in the book, he had brandished a cake knife at his wife, and it was a violent enough situation that he had to spend some time in prison. There is also another time when an unexpected kiss happens for Cassandra, and it is someone who is very committed to a monogamous relationship with someone else. And that is, I think, in many ways to be expected in this kind of a novel, but he's someone who's older and she's younger. Like, my antennae were vibrating a little bit with this idea of like whether or not this was kind of a sexual assault sort of a situation. So in thinking about these problematic areas, I think I'm going to call it problematic light. There's not a ton here to be concerned about. And in fact, for a book that is written in 1948, there's relatively little. So we're going to close by taking a look at the prose at the very end of the book. So if you are someone who has not yet read the book, you might not want to listen to this last part. And I'll tell you right now, I'm going to read this. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, but I'm not going to say anything at the end that you're going to really miss. So I can say right now, in fact, what I usually do at the end, which is thank you for tuning in and happy reading. For those of you who have read the book and want to dig into the end and see why this prose is so great, we will move on. Okay, great to think now I can speak, with abandon. I have to say, as usual, I was not paying attention to the plot, and my shitty memory means that I had totally forgotten what happened. And when they are going and looking for Rose, and then they hear Neil's voice in the inn where Rose is staying, I was shook. I thought that was so well earned. I thought it was like, so in an ending of a book, if something is well earned, what should happen is the reader should be shook. But then the reader should be like, oh my God, obviously. And that is exactly what happened. I was like, duh, all of this kind of tension between them and how like Neil hates her and all of that kind of stuff so should have been pointing me toward the fact that there was a lot of sexual energy. And I love the way that Dodie Smith spells it out and pinpoints the minute, like way back at the beginning of the book, when they have this kind of antic time with, she's in a bear coat and she's running away and they think she's an actual bear and all this stuff is happening. But to know that the sort of the sparks were there in the very beginning makes so much sense. It's such a deft ending. And then, of course, if you are me and you want a romantic ending, you're then rooting for Simon and Cassandra. And the way that Dodie Smith handles it is so excellent. So we're going to take a look at that now. On page 341, we're at the last 3 pages of the book. At last he said, this is Simon and Cassandra together. At last he said, I wish I could take you to America with me. Would you like to come? For a second, I thought it was just a joking remark, but he asked me again, would you, Cassandra? Then something about the way he spoke my name made me sure that if I said yes, he would ask me to marry him. And I couldn't do it, though I don't think I fully knew why until now. Then a little further down. I didn't make any mistake. I know that when he nearly asked me to marry him, it was only an impulse, just as it was when he kissed me on Midsummer Eve. A mixture of liking me very much and longing for Rose. So what's excellent about that is that we have Smith pulling back a little bit. It's not this super tidy thing where, one brother is in love with one sister and then they can and the other is in love with the other and they can swap sisters and it's very neatly going to happen and you'll have a double marriage. Like, she's noting here that there is a lot of energy and attraction between them, but that probably Simon is still in love with Rose. What's beautiful about that, though, is that we have enough of his attraction and enough of his admiration and his appreciation of how Cassandra is this unique, interesting, wacky person that we don't at all feel like Cassandra is diminished, even though she would have gotten the proposal, but she understands that he is still, in fact, in love with Rose, which is more realistic. So then she has this very neat kind of synopsis, and it's so excellent. I mean, Smith here is doing the opposite of Jacob wrestling in that she's kind of laying the whole thing out for us in a way that is very satisfying. She says this. She's talking about Simon's love for Rose. It is part of a follow my leader game of second best we have all been playing. Rose with Simon, Simon with me with Stephen, and Stephen, I suppose, with that detestable Leda Fox Cotton. It isn't a very good game. The people you play it with are apt to get hurt. Perhaps even Leda has, though I can't say the thought of her harrows me much. So then a little further down. The daylight is going. I can hardly see what I am writing and my fingers are cold. There is only one more page left in my beautiful blue leather manuscript book, but that is as much as I shall need. I don't intend to go on with this journal. I have grown out of wanting to write about myself. I only began today out of a sense of duty. I felt I ought to finish Rose's story off tidily. I seem to have finished my own off too, which I didn't quite bargain for. So this is such a lovely meta moment here. We have this idea that she's coming to the end of the 3 journals that she has been keeping, and in a very tidy way, she's also coming to the end of the story. And in some ways, that is a melancholy statement by her because she's still very much in love with Simon. So then down a little bit, it isn't a bit of use my pretending I'm not crying, because I am. Pause to mop up. Better now. There's that immediacy. It's so good. Perhaps it would really be rather dull to be married and settled for life. Liar, it would be heaven. Only half a page left now. Shall I fill it with I love you, I love you, I love you, like father's page of cats on the mat? No, even a broken heart doesn't warrant a waste of good paper. There is light down in the castle kitchen. Tonight I shall have my bath in front of the fire, with Simon's gramophone playing. Topaz has it on now, much too loud, to bring father back to earth in time for tea. But it sounds beautiful from this distance. She is playing the berceuse from Stravinsky's The Firebird. It seems to say, "What shall I do? Where shall I go?" You will go into tea, my girl, and a much better tea than you would have come by this time last year. A mist is rolling over the fields. Why is summer mist romantic and autumn mist just sad? There was mist on Midsummer Eve when we drove into the dawn. He said he would come back. Only the margin left to write on now. I love you, I love you, I love you. So in many ways, we have this incredible ending where it is like somewhat ambivalent. We have this idea that she knows she shouldn't marry Simon, although she's in love with him. And we have this idea that she has made this giant arc, that she has really evolved in many different ways, although she is very beautifully in the same place. But what has happened is she has finished writing this book that we are holding in our hands, and you have a sense that she is ready to keep writing. When she says she doesn't need to write about herself anymore, she's speaking to the idea of writing more in the future. But what she is delivering is something that's a bit more forlorn, a bit more unclear. And in some ways, I think you can read that as a result of the war. This is a book that is optimistic and inspirational in lots of ways, but it's also sort of realistic in the sense that she understands she can't have what she really wants. But the most beautiful thing, and I think this is the reason why the BBC called it such an inspiring novel, is that she's done so much thinking about writing and so much thinking about creation, that we understand that she's going to go on and do all sorts of things that are going to be very satisfying for her. I think it's just such an artful ending. So speaking of artful endings, I might just leave it right there, and I'll say it again to all of you who have hung on until this point. I really appreciate you tuning in. I hope you loved this book as much as I did, and I hope you come back soon to listen to a lecture on something else. If you haven't read it and it sounds interesting, check out Cassandra at the Wedding. So good. Okay. Thank you so much for tuning in. Happy reading.